Okay, so welcome everybody. This is All Our Children's monthly webinar. This is our topic tonight is Education Equity as Racial Reconciliation. My name is Lally Lloyd. I'm the director of All Our Children's National Network, and I want to give a shout out and a thank you to Julie Lytle, the executive director of Province 1, the Episcopal Provinces of New England, who is our technical host tonight and providing this platform so that we can be together. Thank you, Julie. I want to make sure that as folks come into the call that you mute your phones, please, and you'll have a chance to, we'll talk about the chat function in just a minute. That will be a way for you to participate in the call. Just a couple of words of framing and introduction. I'm going to open us first with a prayer. Then I'll say a little bit about All Our Children, and then move us into our topic and introduce our two presenters. So let me open with this word of prayer. This is written by a Bishop Stephen Charleston, a bishop in the Episcopal tradition and a member of the Choctaw Nation. Let me not look away, O God, from any truth I should see. Even if it is difficult, let me face the reality in which I live. I do not want to live inside a cosseted dream, imagining I am the one who is always right, or believing only what I want to hear. Help me to see the world through other eyes, to listen to voices distant and different, to educate myself to the feelings of those with whom I think I have nothing in common. Break the shell of my indifference. Draw me out of my prejudices and show me your wide variety. Oh, let me not look away. Amen. All Our Children's mission is to build the movement for education justice by supporting congregations and their members who are exploring, forming, and leading community partnerships with public schools. We do this because too many children, and most of them living in poverty and many of them children of color, receive a substandard education, vastly different from their white and more affluent peers. And this is not what God dreams for God's beloved people. We believe that Jesus showed the church how to engage our communities, how to serve children, and how to challenge injustice. Our vision is of 1,000 partnerships at the local, state, and national level, supporting their members in taking action and advocating for education equity. All Our Children hosts events, webinars like this one, and we create and curate print and video materials and online tools to help people at every stage of partnership learn how to shorten their own learning curve and learn how to build the alliances and the partnerships that they want. We connect leaders and volunteers with one another, people like you, through calls like this and our conferences, and we are building a community of hope, a community of encouragement and of relationships. This is our third of our fourth Tuesday webinars. Each month we invite 2 or 3 people in our network and among our allies to explore a vibrant topic in our work together, a challenge or a question to connect about connecting a congregation with a nearby school. We're pleased to have you with us tonight. Thank you for joining us. Our topic tonight is Education Equity as Racial Reconciliation. And our format will be that we'll spend about half an hour in discussion between me and our 2 panelists, whom I'll introduce in just a moment, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. And then together we will do a brief feedback evaluation so that we can learn and do this better better next time, and we will end the webinar promptly at 8:15 Eastern Time. Before I introduce our presenters, I want to introduce my colleague, Mary Liz Murray, who is not visible on the screen, but she's right here with us, and she's going to be moderating the chat room. Mary Liz, why don't you say a little bit more about that chat function and give some instructions for folks to participate, please?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Mary Liz. You will hear me tonight, but not see me. The chat function is located on the right hand of your screen. It is available to everyone who's participating. You'll see I've posted a message that would love for you to introduce yourself. Let us know your home church or the church you are representing on this call and the city. That way we can see where people are joining us from, and maybe you'll find somebody in your local area that you didn't know was going to join us or interested in this topic. So the chat is open to everyone. We'd love to have you introduce yourself. While the call goes on, I will be asking a couple questions in there for our participants to answer based off of the discussion, as well as moderating questions that you would like to hear our panelists answer in our Q&A section. So if something comes to mind as you hear this discussion going on and you would like further explanation, or you'd like to dig in a little deeper, or you have a follow-up, just post your question, let me know who it's for, and I will keep a running list so that we can ask those questions in our Q&A period.
Thanks, Mary Liz. So as I said, our topic tonight is education equity as racial reconciliation. And speaking for myself, as a white person, I don't often have these conversations in mixed race contexts. And these are important conversations for us to have together. The white people on the call today are going to have a chance to practice. We're going to practice having these conversations so we can get better at them and be more confident. Our panelists tonight, Zakiya Jackson and Kasara Spencer, belong to two other Christian traditions other than the Episcopal tradition, which is where I come from and from where many in the All Our Children Network come from. So we might be languaging this work a little bit differently. We might try to dig beyond the buzzword of reconciliation, which is a word that we use a lot in our denomination, and talk about the what and the how of what we mean. I want to start by reminding all of us of two statistics that demonstrate that education inequity has a very distinct race vector. The first is that the racial achievement gap is dramatic. Black fourth graders scored 26 points lower on a national reading assessment than their white peers, while Hispanic fourth graders scored 24 points lower. And these differences are the equivalent to about 2 grade levels. The second statistic is that graduation rates for students of color are lower than for white students. During the 2013-14 school year, 87% of white students graduated from high school on time, while 76% of Hispanic students and 73% of Black students earned a high school diploma on time. Our presenters tonight bring to us a wealth of experience as leaders grounded in church with passion for education equity. Zakiya Jackson, wave Zakiya. There's Zakiya, is the Director of National Partnerships at the Expectations Project. Zakiya is also a writer and speaker at the intersections of spiritual formation, racial justice, and African American culture. An essay that she wrote called Responding to the War on Black Bodies was published in Leaven, a journal of Christian ministry. Welcome, Zakiya.
Thank you.
Kasara Spencer, Director of the Micah Association in Richmond, Virginia, which is one of the giants that All Our Children stands on in terms of its depth and breadth of experience working with local schools and local congregations. Kasara has 2 master's degrees, one in divinity and one in social work. and she was a speaker at All Our Children's New Hampshire Regional Forum a year ago. Welcome, Kasara.
Thank you.
So we've asked each of you to give us a brief introduction, a couple minutes, about who you are and what you do in your work, and how you personally felt the call to pursue this work at the intersection between church and school. Kasara, would you start for us, please?
Mm-hmm. Well, like you said, I serve as program director for the Micah Association, which is a part of Richmond Hill, which is an ecumenical retreat center here in Richmond, Virginia. I also serve as the dean of the Koinonia School of Race and Justice, which is also at Richmond Hill. Richmond Hill has a four-pillared mission: spiritual growth, prayer, healing, hospitality, and racial reconciliation. And so when I came to this work, I actually came to this work with Micah after I was serving on the as dean or faculty for Koinonia. And as I began to be engaged in Micah, I recognized that Micah needed to come to the next stage or the next point in its existence, because let me explain what Micah is. I guess I need to backtrack. Larry, I thank you for recognizing Micah and its contribution. But Micah is an association of faith partners that support and volunteer in Richmond Public Schools elementary schools. It is an interfaith community. It is a network of faith partner volunteers who engage in the school system in a variety of ways based on what the school system is expressing as needs. Most commonly, those needs are lunch buddies, classroom assistants. It can be tutoring or mentoring, or even material support, back to school supplies and things of that nature, supply drives. And Micah grew out of the efforts of a few local churches to engage in schools approximately 17 years ago, where they began to have individual relationships with schools, attempting to support the academic achievement in Richmond Public Schools, which were seeing a decrease or struggling student achievement at the time. And so by the time I engaged in Micah, my interest was in continuing to engage faith partners in issues that represented the legacy of slavery and injustice in our local Metro Richmond area. There was an incredible response to Brown versus Board here in Virginia. Massive resistance was real. Public schools shut down as opposed to being integrated or desegregated. And those ripple effects are still being felt in our community today. And so when I engaged in this work, it was really in an effort to continue to involve faith partners or churches or the local congregations in very real issues in our community. Did I answer all of what you asked?
Yes. Thank you very much, Kasara. Zakia, will you introduce yourself and say some words about your work and what called you to be at this intersection?
Yeah, I'll start with what called me. I remember I was born in Washington, D.C. and grew up in Tennessee, and at one point my family moved to Nashville. And I remember distinctly one afternoon as a young teen riding around town with my mom, and we just kept passing so many churches, just so many churches on the way to wherever we were going. And I remember as a teen thinking, I wonder why my city isn't transformed with all these churches everywhere. I wonder why there are any social ills, right? Kind of was what I was thinking. I wonder why everyone more or less doesn't have what they need if there are all these churches presumably filled with people who believe that we're supposed to live like Christ. And so that, before I knew any terms like systemic injustice and I knew kind of the things that I've come to learn now, I had this sense in me that people of faith should make a radical difference in the communities they embody. And that is what continues to call me to the work that I do. So as Lally mentioned, I work for the Expectations Project, and what we do is support faith communities in doing advocacy for low-income schools, which are often filled with young Black and brown students. Mm-hmm. And as we see it, some churches are comfortable with advocacy, some are not. Some are comfortable and aren't sure which direction to go. Some have been engaging. It sounds like some of what Kasara was saying, they've started doing individual interaction as a church with schools, what we call compassionate service. They're tutoring or providing meals or things like that. And maybe they're interested in, they've been exposed to see that the issues are more than they realize, right? Is often the case.
Absolutely.
So we're trying to come along and help people of faith galvanize around understanding the systemic issues and getting involved in them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to just start a little bit by grounding us a little bit more in your own experience. Zakia, you both referred to it a little bit, but I wonder, Zakia, I'm going to ask you first, please, if you would just say a little bit more about your own experience during your K-12 education of race segregation. What did you notice?
Yeah, so I had, I'll call it opportunity to be homeschooled, to attend private school, and then to also attend public school. And one of the things that I noticed in private school as well as public school is a type of intellectual segregation, if you will, or academic segregation. So in my private school, I was one of very few other Black students there. In my public school, that was not the case. But one example stands out. When I was a senior in high school, and I went to an academically rigorous high school. We had to apply to get in. Every student had to have a certain grade level. In Tennessee, we call them magnet schools, is what I attended. So senior year, we've all applied to however many schools our guidance counselor forced us to apply to. And we're starting to get notices of whether or not we were accepted. And one of my classmates overheard that I was accepted to MIT. We're sitting in class, and he starts talking about it kind of loudly because he's excited. And our math teacher overheard this, and our math teacher, in complete shock, singled me out and said, Ms. Jackson, you got into MIT? And just kind of a complete disbelief. And I just remember the hotness of that moment for me, and how embarrassing it was, and how odd it was, because he didn't do that to the white males. There was maybe one or two white males in my class who also got in, and I was a good student. I got A's in his class, right? I wasn't a poor performer, but he segregated us academically, and so that is something that stands out to me in both my private and public education. When I was younger, in middle school, I was, you can probably tell by these huge glasses, quite the nerd. And I won my final year of middle school, I was set up to win 4 academic awards. And a couple of days later, I was told I was only going to get 1 award because it wouldn't be fair to the other students. So they took away my awards. And I had never experienced, I had been at that school 3 years, I had never experienced other students having things taken away because they had too much. So those are just 2 of the examples that I would give of experiencing segregation in a way that we don't always talk about it.
Yeah, yeah. And Kasara, I invite you to answer the same question. And if you would also, if you're comfortable and if it's relevant, to weave into your answer what might be different among children that you know personally, not kids that you work with, but children that you know personally in your extended family or in your neighborhood or something like that. So we get a little bit of a generational sense if it's different. But your own experience first, please.
Yeah, I actually am a product of Richmond Public Schools, which is a school system in which our volunteers serve. I started in the school system in the mid to late 70s. And what I most remember is attending school and church with some of my teachers, with a sense of community of teachers who not only cared but could see me in my neighborhood and will tell my mom if I was doing something. So, you know, it wasn't just concern for academics, but also concern for me as a person. About the end of elementary school, and we also went, my mother was able to have us attend a model school, what they used to call model schools, which were schools where there was a certain level of academics and certain kind of experience happening with the curriculum in that school. And this was my elementary school experience. We moved out into the county, and before I finished elementary school, to predominantly white schools, and that experience was so much, it was just different, not only because I was going to school with students I didn't know, but I didn't know the teachers. They didn't live in my community. And even though I couldn't really process it at the time, I could feel something's not the same. You know, something's different. My mother tells a story that when we moved from the city to the county, we actually, me and my siblings, my sisters, were academically ahead of the other students, which is not the narrative that was being told about Richmond schools at the time, and even now it's not the narrative. So we moved out into the county. That whole environment was different. The tone of the schools, even the age of the schools and the way the schools were built was different. And the teachers approached us differently. I had some good teachers, so I don't necessarily have an experience from a teacher that was directly different. I could feel it, the difference. And since I was a high achiever, I tended to be in particularly math and reading classes as the only black student, or one of two in the class. Again, at the time, I didn't have the sophistication of thought, just the observation. Oh, I'm the only one. And in one particular class, in one particular instance, I did have an incident with a classmate who called me the N-word. I can't remember what the conflict was at the time. I know I was extremely shocked because these are students that didn't display any of that kind of animosity, and the teacher happened to be out of the room at this time. And I had this aggressive interaction, you know, with her, implying that I really didn't belong in the class. That was not a common occurrence for me. However, I did begin to note that if I was achieving at a certain level, then there was a certain amount of interaction with students that looked like me that I didn't have in my classroom. We moved back into the city for my high school. I finished high school in the city, and by that time, the city was beginning to do some experimentation with their schools. They were combining schools across the community, and I was in one building, and my sister graduated from the same school, but she was in a different building. And so for my last 2 years, I actually was in what's now currently John Marshall High School, but they had a high school unit, which was segregated education, but within the same school building. So the higher achievers were in this high school unit where we took certain caliber of classes, and for some classes we went to the regular, so-called regular classes in the other building. So in my education, we had somewhat of I experienced segregated education, both within the same school system, you know, by virtue of the classes I took, even the location of those classes. So it was like a population within a population. Again, at the time growing up, I knew something wasn't quite right. I couldn't frame it because there was not a lot of conversation happening in this city at that time about race, not out in the open. My own grandmother wouldn't even talk about her experiences, and she lived to be 90, in her mid-90s. And so it wasn't until I was older and I returned to the city as an adult with adult eyes, now being able to say, oh, wait, so these are the things that was going on at the time. And even the things I didn't learn about in a predominantly black school system, civil rights in this location, right, in my local city. We learned about protests and things happening in other areas, but as far as what was being taught in our schools, and even in my community to some degree, I didn't hear about it. And so these things were kind of whispered, and unless you knew or you came from a family who were highly or heavily involved, there were some things you just didn't know. And I didn't realize that until I returned with my own children. And so you ask what differences and similarities I see. I do have children. Two of my children are still in public school. My daughter has since graduated. My daughter attended a high school with an IB program, so you still have the segregated population, you know, where advanced courses are only allowed for certain students, and you have to apply for that. You have to be approved. Interestingly, my middle son, I put him in an all-boys school for a variety of reasons, and that was hard for me. That was conflictual for me because I support public education. And here I am putting my son in an all-boys school. However, I know that that was the right thing for me to do for that child. Of the same token, I didn't see anything happening in that school that could not happen in a public school. It's learning and relationship. I don't see why they can't happen in a public school. There may not be the will, but the ability, I think, is there. But my two sons now attend what they call specialty high schools. Those high schools, you have to apply, you interview in order to get in, and you take tests. So again, I'm a parent who has a certain amount of education, you know, efficacy, and so I raised my children in a certain way so that I have the efficacy and I have the personal resources, I would say, to be able to push and advocate for my children to attend that kind of school. Other parents don't have that. And so the things that I see that are the same, we still have IB programs, so we still have the segregated community of children who get to have the more challenging curriculum within a subset of children who don't have that opportunity. So in many ways, things are the same and yet they're different. There are facilities issues now that, of course, weren't happening then that are impactful for public education and for quality of education. Of course, there's funding issues, which I think were probably prevalent when I was attending school, but it's just not, I mean, it's been exacerbated over the last few years. And the quality of education, I know we have dedicated teachers. I know we have qualified teachers. However, I think some of the administrative and the testing constraints impact their ability to really rise to the occasion that they could. I think they're doing their best. Don't get me wrong. I would never criticize a teacher and say a teacher was not doing their best, because I know they are working in the face of many odds, especially when some of our children show up with the circumstances that they come from. Children don't leave that at home, they bring them. But those are some of the things that I see that are very different compared to when I was going to school in the school system. We just, like I said, I saw my teachers. I saw my teachers at church. You know, my sons, I know they don't see their teachers at church. And that's not to say their teachers don't go to church. I'm just saying that, you know, that kind of network is not as prevalent as it used to be. Yeah.
So I'm wondering how education equity work intersects with racial justice, racial reconciliation, racial healing dialogue initiatives or programs within the work that you do, that you see happening either locally in your respective programs or in the wider conversation. I mean, do do the topics, do the issues, do they intersect? Ziki, I'm going to ask you to start first.
Yeah, yes, they absolutely
And I guess part
do.
of what I'm asking, I mean, we know that they intersect.
Yeah,
I guess what I'm interested in is, can people talk about it? Can we name that?
I think it's really hard for people to name in general because the unpacking racial justice is hard for people to name across religious practices and racial backgrounds. I have found it to be challenging for people to unpack it. I think that sometimes people seem to believe, well, no, they just do believe that the pathway to justice starts with reconciliation, and I actually believe you have to start with justice, and that's how you move closer to reconciliation, right? So if someone tells me that they're really passionate about reconciliation, then I want to start to explore what they know about racial justice to see how far their passion can go and how deep they're going to be able to address things. I love, Kasara, I think that you said, I might quote you wrong, but you talked about unpacking the legacy of slavery and how it still impacts the school system. I think that that's so important because at the root of the formation of this country that we love, and we do love it and believe in it, and that's why we do the things we do, but at its inception, there's an anti-Blackness that permeated into how schools were started, that permeate into how policing was set up, that permeated into how churches were formed. And so in order to even attempt to right those wrongs, specifically in education, we have to look back and we have to acknowledge and we have to kind of start to undo all of the things that are happening. So in my work, not everyone comes in wanting to know about the history of race in education. However, I think at some point you have to cross it, you have to go there, or there's only so far you can go. Our president likes to say we can't tutor our way out of this problem, right? Tutoring is really important and it matters and it helps. But one of the things that pressed me to pursue more education and more learning myself, I did an after-school tutoring and summer enrichment program to help kids become first-generation college students. And it was helping them. But I realized after working there 5 or 6 years that my students' younger siblings were still needing the exact same help they were because the system wasn't changing. And that pushed me to start to understand systems in a better way.
I think one of the shocking things that I learned way too late in my life was the way that the GI Bill and the federal government's mortgage guarantee programs were explicitly set up to exclude that benefit from Black families. And as we know, over the last 50 years, the gradual, healthy, long-term growth in housing values, not the peaky ones that crashed, but has been probably the single biggest driver of the accumulation of wealth among white people. And if you've excluded large numbers of Black people from that program, you've contributed to the enormous wealth gap between Blacks and whites. So it's the housing regulations that have also been built explicitly to reinforce race bias are certainly a part of our shared history. And if we don't all know the same history, we can't be talking, we don't have a foundation for moving forward to figure out together what needs to happen.
And
Kasara,
I was going to, on that note of what you're talking about, Lally, I didn't really learn about that till I was an adult. And I'm Black, and I went to school in Nashville where all the sit-ins happened, and there's plenty of reasons I should have known that. And my parents were educated and worked to educate us on lots of history, but that's something that not shared and that is hidden, is honestly hidden away from our consciousness.
Yeah. Kusara, so the question, is how in your work do these issues of education equity and justice or race equity, how do you find that they intersect, that people are actually able to talk about how one causes the other? It's not just a correlation, it's a causative.
Right. It's interesting. In my preparing for this evening, I recognized that this conversation isn't being had in our faith partnerships, in our congregation, as a whole. Okay, there may be some pockets of conversation, but in what I found in this role is that there's a disconnect between the opportunity, and I call it an opportunity, to engage in our elementary schools in this way, and the larger systemic issues that created the opportunity, both historic and current, right? And what I find is the same thing that Zakia referred to. It's a difficult conversation to have. It is so easy, particularly in what I find in faith circles, to speak about it as being the hands and feet of God without recognizing that justice piece is also a very much important part of God's character, right? And so there is certainly a place for meeting real needs, right? There's certainly a place for crisis intervention. There's a place for what I call equality, which is what I believe most of our faith communities think about when they think about serving in our schools, making sure that students have the same, and it's always compared to another group. But if I'm starting from a negative place, right, and you're starting from a 5, and we're both given 15, I'm still behind. And that's the piece that I don't believe our faith partners understand in general. I don't believe they understand the systemic issues. Like Kia talked about learning about them as an adult. The same was, likewise. But I know people older than me that can't hold that conversation. I serve as Dean of Cornelia School of Race and Justice, and part of that was to get people really exploring their own issues with talking about race. It's so much easier to say it's an economic issue, right? Without exploring why we think a certain subset of the population struggles with economics. And in Richmond, we have one of the highest concentrations of public housing on the East Coast still. So we have high concentrations of poverty, predominantly people of color. That's not an accident. Our city was intentionally created, right, with these subdivisions and these communities. And so getting out of it is going to take intentional conversation. The conversations to get into this situation were intentional, right? They might not have been as public as we think, but they were intentional. And so we have to bring that intent of justice and racial reconciliation. We have to bring that to what we're doing. But it is not an easy conversation. It is not a comfortable conversation. I have worked, before I came to MICA, I've worked in one of our public housing communities with white churches who were connecting, working to support community leaders, right, around self-identified community issues. And all of that was fine and good, but nothing about race was being discussed, nothing. But you had all of these racial undertones happening that was impacting the relationships on some level. I find that problematic. I find it problematic to talk about addressing issues that are symptomatic and that are not that don't identify the real issue. They don't get to the crux of the matter. If I have a cold, I take cold medicine. I'm masking a symptom. There's a cold virus. And so what I find problematic is when we have brought our faith partners together to talk about a need that is created by the systemic injustices, but we keep putting what I call Band-Aids on the surface wounds, right? But we don't get down to the deeper wounds. And if we don't get down to the deeper wounds, we're just going to keep bumping it, and it's just going to keep festering generation after generation. So at some point, there's got to be intergenerational conversation about, okay, what's really going on, and how do we change our attitudes so we can begin to look at the solutions in a different way, right, that they really get to the root of the issue.
So I've heard you both say that that in general, conversations about race don't come up easily or early in the work that you're doing with congregations. Is that different in congregations that are predominantly white from congregations that are predominantly people of color? And I guess I'll let Zakia take this one first.
Yeah, I think that yes, but sometimes people of color also have a hard time talking about it, but it's a different thing. It's a different struggle, I think, than white congregations may face. So, for example, we work with two denominations that are really comfortable with advocacy. It's in their DNA as Black denominations to want to address those things. They're having some challenge getting people to see education as still being a civil rights issue. And so pressing the matter from that angle and getting into, I think because we're not where we used to be, because there has been some change, that can be a challenging racial conversation, right? Because we do have more, I will say, access perhaps than we used to have. But I think going back to some of what Kasara was saying, I don't know that the root issue has ever been addressed, so the problem just transforms, it mutates. The problem hasn't actually been solved, though generations before us have done much to address it and help it not be what it was. So it's a sensitive sort of not wanting to offend the elders versus recognizing what the children are still going through, even though their water fountain doesn't say colored only. It's a hard thing to get into sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah. Kasara, do you have some thoughts to add to Zakia's answer?
I would piggyback and I would affirm what Zakia said. In some ways, the conversation I found is easier, and it's a different conversation in Black communities. There's already recognition of racial issues. However, in both congregations, it's hard to go deeper, right? To go deeper into the racial conversation. And I think it is very much for those reasons that she stated. Oh, we've got so many resources now, the kids just don't want to learn. So again, it becomes back to an individual issue for people, individual behavior, individual responsibility. And I think it is very challenging to continue to point to the systemic issues because the focus tends to be so much on what behaviors are, right? Individual student behavior, or how parents aren't involved. So then it becomes this personal responsibility issue. And it becomes very challenging to pull back and say, maybe these are unhealthy responses or coping mechanisms.
Right.
To a system that is broken and is not designed to function to include people of color or people in the low income, So, and not to take away from people's responsibility, right? But to acknowledge that that the system needs fixing, or at the very least, modification and acknowledgement that there's advocacy that's necessary.
Are there resources cultural competency competency maybe that you're aware of that might help a congregation get started? Have you seen a tactic, basically, I guess is sort of what I'm asking for, that can help a congregation first sort of get different eyes, which I think is what's needed, and then have the courage to practice a conversation that they may not have known or been comfortable having before. Kasara, any resources that you found that have been helpful?
Well, there are some organizations in our area, Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities, Hope in the Cities Initiatives of Change. They have trust building programs. They have race and programming and workshops to help people explore their own perceptions, their own biases, their own stereotypes, the things that they operate from. I also have seen congregations, sometimes led by pastors, sometimes led by lay leaders, begin to build bridges across their differences. So, for example, we've had predominantly white congregations and predominantly black congregations begin to have exchange worship services and then begin to have meals together and then begin to develop a relationship where they're comfortable talking about issues of race and justice. Then I personally participated in one congregation's exploration of race. It was a predominantly white congregation, and they were, all of a sudden I'm drawing a blank on the name of the video series, but it's a video series you may be familiar with of a woman who did her family research, and she found that her family was involved in the slave trade.
Traces of the Trade.
Traces of the Trade, yes. And they were working through Traces of the Trade last year. I was a part of their Lenten series. And they invited me and Ben Campbell in to lead them in just an exercise about race. And so we talked about the local history and how white privilege was developed, and then led them in some table talk and some facilitated conversations. So locally, I see churches begin to take it upon themselves to explore for themselves, and to learn, what is slavery, what is this history, how do we deal with it, how do we examine ourselves. The School of Race and Justice was formed at Richmond Hill to give people a space where they could begin to explore these issues first within themselves, and then to have conversations interpersonally, and then to be able to engage in the community. And so those kinds of resources and conversations I'm seeing are happening more and more frequently out in public forums, as well as, like I said, those one-on-one individual institutions that are deciding we've got to do something different. We've got to begin to have the conversation.
So it sounds like part of your answer is that it's not so much that it's not like there's a book or a workbook that you can do, but there are experiential workshops that involve people coming together in real time with other people, maybe with some structure and some supportive guidance to help them do this. Zakia, is that your experience as well, or is that analogous to what you see as being helpful?
I think that, and it sounds like you were saying this too, Kasara, I think that both are helpful, and that you have to hopefully have someone guiding you who knows when it's time for what, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's really important for people to do some homework, and I've been reading a book called Trouble I've Seen, Changing the Way the Church Views Racism by Drew Hart. So I think it's important to, maybe as a group, read books like that are really going to be challenging, and it's going to be important that you not read that necessarily all by yourself, that you have conversations and discussions that are real honest, where you might say, I don't believe any of that, mostly because I don't, or because it hurts my feelings, or whatever it is. This is not to say that books are without fault, but whatever it stirs in you. I think exploring racial justice is very stirring, and too often we ignore the stirring. And there's not a good place or avenue to release those stirrings. And I think dealing with the stirrings is just as important as reading the book, right? And then there are other times where you've read 5 or 6 books, it's too much, right? You need to take a break, and you need to do something experiential. You need to go to a conference, or you need to go to a team training, building opportunity that is, credible to help you work through that. Or you need to have a special guest come for a series at your church. Fly somebody in if there's not someone local that you trust. But to me, when I have led workshops before that are on the topic of racial justice or reconciliation, at the beginning of almost every one, I remind people that we're going to get stirred tonight or this afternoon, right? And I try to set a climate that people are prepared for that they have an opportunity to not run away from it. I can't control anybody, so if you're going to run, you're going to run. But be in an environment that invites us to deal with that in a healthy way.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. What stirs me in that answer is the opportunity for the Holy Spirit to be a spirit of healing, both within the individual who might otherwise resist, but also within the community. So I really appreciate sort of leaning into that that stirring. That's great. My last question before we open it up to questions from our participants is, so we're just going to do, if you wouldn't mind, each of you a quick answer to this one. What actions can participants take individually or as a group to make the next step, to create change, but the next incremental change in whatever their local context is around education and race inequity? And Vicki, I'm going to ask you to go first on this one.
I think the next step begins with an honest reckoning of where you are. Each congregation is probably in a different place, or each team or each group. But if you've been studying and reading for a while, then I encourage you to have a next step be something geared towards practice. And maybe a practice of going to a school board meeting as a group to hear and learn what's going on to give you better context. Maybe it's actually doing some advocacy and calling your senators about things that are going on or that will be voted on. If you're not informed enough for those pieces, maybe it is saying we've been reading, but we need to take it deeper and stretch ourselves more. So let's watch a video series as a group and then have someone come in and speak to us about it first. I think it's important that whatever you're doing, it be a stretch. It be something that is pushing you and your congregation that might be, or your group, that might be something outside of the norm for you. I like to get radical. So it can even be a little, a stretch that you really feel and that's going to ache the next day, like certain yoga poses. But it's really important to me that when we stretch people, we have the resources there to help them succeed. Same as in teaching, right? And so make a strategic plan for yourself and take the next step that will really push you. And if you don't know, I think that there are resources to help you figure that out.
Yeah, great. Or some of the participants are sharing information that they know about resources, and so we'll be sharing that. We'll be sharing that with everybody. So, Kasara, what would you recommend to somebody or a small group of folks who want to figure out how to take their next step?
I'm going to say make sure you write down what Zakiya just said. And so I'm going to give what I consider like a balance to that component. Pray, and then pray some more. Because an important component of this work is to work where God is working. Work where you are sensing your calling. because that's what's going to give you that motivation beyond that stretch, right? When you hyperextend it, right, you got to have something to reach back on. And so I definitely would say to make sure you assess where you are so you know where you want to go or where the next step is, because it may not be where you want to go, but it may be where that next step is. And make sure you're stepping where God is working, because I do believe this work is the work, it's God's work. And as people of faith, we want to make sure we are working where God is working. And so in addition to all of those tangible pieces, I think we have to be sure that we're also tapping into that spirit that tells us this is the work I'm called to do, because that will sustain us in those moments where it gets difficult, when it's uncomfortable. And I think it is right to say we should be uncomfortable, because that means that we have the opportunity for change and that we have an opportunity for the Spirit to comfort us in the midst of that. And so it can also be a growing experience spiritually as well. But I would definitely say you have to honestly assess where you are and determine where I want to be, or where we need to be, or where we feel called to be. Because I believe that that calling is important. I've seen folks do what makes sense, but they don't have the internal preparation to be there. And that can be more damaging than beneficial. And so we want to be sure that we're doing our internal work as well, because a lot of things make sense. But everything good is not godly, and we have to be careful about that. I believe we have to be careful about that. Because some things, once you break it, it's real hard to get it, unbroken.
Thank you. Thank you both for for those words, for your wisdom and your courage. I appreciate that very much. We're going to turn for a couple moments now to our participants who've been listening to us and see what questions they may have, and for that we'll turn to Mary Liz. Mary Liz, what have you got for us?
Thanks, Lally, and thanks to James and Peter, who were very active on the chat, and to everybody else who's been listening in and watching. If you have any last questions while we do this, to the other participants on the call, don't hesitate to write them into the chat box. The first one I'm going to ask is from James McKim, who is joining us from Province 1, and he's part of the committee in Province 1 for racial reconciliation. And Sarah, I'm going to ask you this question first, only because I'm more familiar with Micah's work with individual congregations. But Sakia, if you think of anything to add, please feel free when Sarah is done. One of the questions is, and I'm wondering if there are some specific examples of congregations you can think of, Kasara, who have engaged the school board or the local government around the issue of education equity and or racial reconciliation, and how they did that. What were some steps that they took? What did that look like in practice in Richmond?
In Richmond, one church in particular is the first church that comes to mind whenever I think about that kind of advocacy, and that's St. Paul's Episcopal. They have been active in advocating for increased state funding, for changing the funding formula, and some of that was personal individual efforts of congregants who are connected to the Micah partnership at Woodville Elementary. So they've shown up at school board meetings, they've talked to school administration, they have worked in grassroots community efforts. We have one called Support Our Schools, Friends of RPS, and they have participated in rallies around increased state funding. We have a member of that church who also serves in the General Assembly, and she has come through Micah. And so that church in particular, I know for sure, has been a very strong advocate for public education and living out that advocacy in their connections, in their networks, in their personal connections, as well as the recognition of the church as a whole, because it's a well-known church locally for advocacy and for supporting educational efforts. Did I miss a part of your question?
No, I don't
Mary?
think so.
Okay.
Zakia, do you have any examples that come to mind from your work with the Expectations Project or in your community in DC?
Yeah, you know, I just have, you all may be familiar with this, but just a reminder that in working with government officials, repetition really does make a difference. And I think sometimes we think that if we don't have 55 people, you know, ready to storm somebody's office, then we can't make a difference. And that's just not necessarily true. So just an encouragement, if you had 10 people, even 5, if you started with 5, who consistently petitioned the same school board members or went to the same meetings month after month after month making noise, it does make a difference. People do hear those things. So just a reminder that it's great if you have an elaborate strategic plan that is in-depth, but if you also have a starting place with a few people who are willing to show up, that is a good starting place as well. And so the example that I would give, it wasn't just one congregation, but several congregations in our work in Indianapolis started partnering with United Way and some other local orgs because they wanted to expand funding for preschool. And they were able to get enough funding to allow, it was basically a temporary experimental piece of the budget to allow more children to get preschool funding in Indianapolis. And nobody had to reinvent the wheel, they just had to work together in that example. So.
Right, I think sometimes churches may find more success going to another organization before going directly into the school or the school board because some of those organizations already have systems in place for advocacy, or they have a bigger group, or they've been doing it longer. So we see that in our mature partnerships a lot, that they have allies in the nonprofit community that may be secular that can help them. And I think both of you just spoke to that. And I think the only other thing that was coming up a lot in our conversation was the idea of how much time systemic change takes and how that can both be overwhelming and sometimes a barrier, but also needs to be kept in mind as you do the work. And the question that comes out of that is, what are some small starting goals that churches can have to take active steps without getting overwhelmed by the idea of systemic change? So we've talked about going to school board meetings and those kinds of things, but are there ways to start even smaller or with racial reconciliation outside of the idea of the school system and with something else in the community?
I want to say that when I get overwhelmed, I usually forget that I'm not Jesus. I'm being a little funny, but seriously, it is depressing. It is, the issues in our public education. It is hard, but if we start getting massively overwhelmed, then I think maybe we need to check ourselves and think that we're thinking that we're supposed to do it all too much, right? Remember who our community is. And if you don't have community in this work, that's a good starting place to find community, even if it's outside of your church. And I think, Mary Liz, as you mentioned, even if it's not necessarily another church, it might be the local grocer who just really cares, right? Start with building community and start with educating yourself. But I think you can go to a school board meeting and not say anything. That doesn't have to be a huge first step. You can just go and start learning about what they're talking about as well, is what I would say. So don't, baby steps are real, but don't shy away from doing things that are foreign under the auspices of this takes time.
Right, right. I think I would point back to what Zakia said earlier about taking stock of where you are and seeing what the next step is. One of the things that in our first class at Koinonia School of Race and Justice, that was a recurring theme. It's just so huge. You know, we want to solve racism like today by pushing this button. Right, it's not going to happen. And so what we discovered was we needed to help people focus on what is the area or what is the issue that you're drawn to, you know, and then drill down from there. So very much, you know, I still think it's important to know what you're called to do and to be as specific in that as possible. Otherwise, I mean, it's a lot to have to deal with, but to be able to pinpoint and say, you know, well, the area of education is, yes, definitely what I'm interested in, but, you know, get even more specific. You know, what can I do? What assets do I have? And what need might that meet? And again, take it from there, being very prayerful, because like you say, you know, no, you're not Jesus, but you want God to, you know, you want to tap into that power, into where God is working, and tap out when you need to, for sure. It's okay. Log off of social media when you had enough. I mean, you know, because it can be very overwhelming, and we all have to manage our personal feelings as well as doing what's right for the community, right? But if we're all wounded and bleeding because we're overwhelmed, then we can't be beneficial. So, yeah.
And our last question before we do a quick evaluation with everybody is, how do we celebrate small successes that keep us going? So what are some ways you've seen churches do this? What are some ways you do this personally? How are we celebrating the small successes so that we can keep doing the work?
Well, I can share with you what we do at our luncheons. We have 4 gatherings for our faith partners a year. At the beginning of the school year, it's a kickoff where we kind of rah, and we get everybody geared up, and we have workshops. But in May, near the end of the school year, we always call it a celebrate, you know, celebrate the time of the school year. And in the past, we call it different things. Sometimes we call it hows and wows. You know, how did you meet that challenge? And wow, what did you do good? So we have it built in kind of to our model of coming together, where we always make it a point of talking about something that went really well and blowing it up. I understand calling it a small success, but I don't think they're small, because, you know, sometimes it takes a tremendous amount of energy to get that one thing done. And just because it might not solve the whole issue, that doesn't mean it's not a big thing, right? So we have it kind of built into what we do, where we are recognizing on a regular basis, you know, and uplifting our church-school partnerships. This is what we did, and this is what we're doing really well. This is what's working. This was challenging, and this is how we overcame that challenge. So that's how we do it. One way we do it. Yeah.
I'm a big fan of personal gestures, so writing notes of thanks and affirmation. If there's budget in the nonprofit budget for $5 gift cards even, I think it goes a long way to acknowledge the volunteers. Most of this is volunteer-based, right? To acknowledge the people who are involved. And then I'm also a big fan of public sort of words and public displays of celebration and gestures. So if a pastor is willing to honor, even by speaking about it during a service, for example, that can be really meaningful for people, putting it in whatever sort of, I guess knowing the people that you want to celebrate, how it would most mean something to them. To some people, it means the world to be mentioned in the Sunday Bulletin. To others, it would mean more to get that $5 gift card. Right? And then also, if possible, taking time to be together and to just talk about what you have accomplished. And honor that. I was surprised this summer. I did a phone call with a bunch of partners and just read out all the things that each partner was working on. And they all felt so excited to hear what each other was doing and what might be coming in the future. And we did it intentionally to celebrate them. We just didn't know they would be so pleased by the celebration. Yeah. So
that's the aspect of our luncheons that we find just most exciting, and we're working to make more room for that fellowship. They love to hear from each other. So I agree with that. Yeah.
Because I think it's lonely work. Sometimes this work is lonely, and it's helpful to hear about others who have committed to the journey. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
And
go ahead, Lally.
Yeah, I was just going to say I think that's a wonderful note for us to shift into the beginning of the conclusion of our call, because this can be lonely work, and that's one of the reasons that we really value these opportunities to be together virtually. And I want to say again a big thank you to both Kasara and Zakia for your leadership in your communities, for the impact that your work is having in the lives and the communities where you live, and also then the ripple effects, right, about how it sort of plays out into the rest of the world. I feel very grateful to know both of you, and I've learned from both of you tonight and in our previous times together. I want to ask folks who are still on the call with us, we're going to shift quickly into an evaluation of how this call went. And if you would type into the chat box. I know a bunch of folks had to leave already, but if people in the chat box would just type in your sense first of what worked well in your experience on the call today, whether it was your experience with the technology or the content or the format that we used or our presenters. We'd love to hear some affirmations, some things that you think worked really well for you tonight. And then similarly, after you've had a chance to share some of that with us, we'd like to know what your suggestions are for how we could do these better. How can we learn from tonight's experience and become better at doing these teachings and these conversations. And while you do that, I am going to begin to wrap up. We'll be sending everybody who joined the call an email that has a link so that you can find a recording of this webinar. Down the road, we're looking into possibilities and options for getting them transcribed and turning them into print material that would be easier to share more widely. But these webinars are open to anybody, and you will also receive an invitation for upcoming webinars, and be sure to share that widely within your communities and among your friends and allies. Our next webinar is not on a Tuesday. It's on Monday, February 27th. We wanted to avoid a conflict with Mardi Gras, which is the next day, so we're moving it to Monday instead of Tuesday. We figured we would not win if we were competing against the pancake suppers. And again, from 7 to 8:15 Eastern Time. Our topic next month is trauma-informed volunteering. What difference does it make? What do we as volunteers going into the schools need to know about brain research that tells us about what the effects of trauma are on students, and secondary trauma on the teachers and the adults who care for those children every day. Our guests include Dawn Coles, who is a founding member of the MICA Association, the program that Kasara leads now, and a long-term volunteer and mentor with students in the Richmond Public Schools. The second is Adina Davidson, a social worker at a high-poverty middle school in Boston, and her team of social workers are supported by the Trinity Church Boston. And our third presenter is Hazel Carter, a professor at the City College of New York, who has done a lot of research on how the community, the broader community, can encourage and expand college attendance and college access for students for whom that path is sometimes rocky to navigate for different reasons. The remaining webinars this spring will all be on the fourth Tuesday from March through May. Stay tuned. Check out our monthly newsletter for topics and information, and you will all be receiving emails of invitation. Thank you all for being with us tonight. Thank you for the work that you're doing in your communities. The work you do makes a difference in the lives of children, communities, and congregations. God bless you, and good night.